I always loved the beach. The sound of the waves, the warm sand beneath my feet, and the endless horizon. It was my escape from the stress of life. So when my friends suggested a weekend trip to a remote coastal town, I jumped at the chance. We arrived at the beach house just before sunset. It was old but charming, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The town, however, felt off. It was eerily quiet, the streets deserted, and the locals avoided eye contact when we passed. "It's just a sleepy fishing village," my friend Mia said, brushing off my unease. "Perfect for some peace and quiet." But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery reds and oranges, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. That night, we decided to have a bonfire on the beach. We gathered driftwood, lit a fire, and sat in a circle, laughing and sharing stories. The stars above were impossibly bright, the waves crashing rhythmically in the distance. Everything felt perfect, until I noticed something out of place. Far down the shoreline, where the moonlight barely touched, a figure stood motionless at the edge of the water. "Hey," I said, nudging Mia. "Do you see that?" She squinted, following my gaze. "Probably just a local out for a walk." But the figure didn't move. As the night wore on, I tried to ignore it, but every time I glanced back, it was still there, standing perfectly still, watching. Back at the beach house, we locked up and settled in for the night. My room faced the ocean, and I left the window open to let in the cool sea breeze. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the long day. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound, a faint tapping like fingernails on glass. Groggy, I sat up and looked around. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. Then I saw it, a hand pressed against the window pane. I froze, my heart racing as I realized someone, or something, was standing outside my second-story window. The fingers were long and thin, the skin pale and glistening like it was wet. I scrambled for my phone, but by the time I turned back, the hand was gone. The next morning, I told my friends what I'd seen, but they laughed it off. "You probably dreamed it," said Alex, shaking his head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We decided to explore the town that day, wandering through its narrow streets and weathered buildings. At a small cafe, I overheard two locals whispering. "The tide brought them in last night," one said, his voice low and fearful. "I saw the footprints near the cliffs." "Sure," the other hissed, glancing around nervously. "If they hear you, they'll come for you too." Before I could ask them what they meant, they hurried out the door. That evening, curiosity got the better of me. I convinced Mia and Alex to walk with me along the cliffs near the house. At first, there was nothing unusual, just sand and rocks. But then we saw them, footprints. They were large and misshapen, with webbed toes, leading from the water's edge up the cliffside. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" Mia asked, her voice uneasy. "They're too big to be an animal," Alex muttered. The tracks led directly to our beach house. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just my window. It came from all around the house, faint and rhythmic. We huddled in the living room, too scared to sleep. The sound grew louder, and then we heard it, the front door rattling, as if something was trying to get in. Alex grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob. "Whatever this is, it's not getting in," he said, his voice shaking. But then we heard the sound of wet footsteps on the floor behind us. We turned and saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their skin pale and slick, their eyes large and black like a fish's. Their mouths were full of needle-like teeth, and they moved with unnatural grace, water dripping from their bodies. Mia screamed, and Alex grabbed a fire poker, swinging it wildly. One of the creatures lunged at him, its movements eerily silent, and he barely managed to shove it back. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Mia's hand. We fled through the back door, stumbling onto the beach. The tide was high, the waves crashing violently, but more of the creatures were emerging from the water, their silhouettes dark against the moonlight. We ran along the shoreline, the creatures chasing us with terrifying speed. Their guttural, clicking noises echoed in the night. We made it to the car, barely managing to start it as one of them slammed against the window, its face inches from mine. Its black eyes stared into mine, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming pull, like it was trying to drag me into the depths. But then the engine roared to life, and we sped away, leaving the town and the creatures behind. Back in the safety of our city, we tried to forget what had happened. But a week later, I woke up to find something strange on my doorstep, a handful of wet sand and a single, webbed footprint. And when I listened closely, I could hear it, the faint sound of waves crashing, even though the ocean was miles away. They weren't done with me. Not yet. After finding the footprint and the wet sand on my doorstep, my paranoia grew. Every night, I would wake up to faint noises, the sound of water dripping, the whisper of waves, and that dreaded tapping on my windows. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a lingering fear from our horrifying encounter at the beach. But the sounds grew louder, and the signs became harder to ignore. One morning, I found more footprints leading up to my apartment door, accompanied by streaks of algae smeared across the floor. The smell of salt water hung heavy in the air. Mia and Alex weren't faring any better. Mia called me in a panic one night, claiming she had seen one of the creatures outside her window. Alex, on the other hand, stopped responding to my calls altogether. Desperate for answers, I decided to return to the beach town where it all began. I drove back alone, the entire trip weighed down by a sense of impending doom. When I arrived, the town looked even more abandoned than before. Shops were boarded up, the streets eerily quiet, and the air felt heavy with moisture. I went straight to the beach house. It stood there as if nothing had happened, its windows dark, the front door slightly ajar. Inside, everything was as we had left it, except for the marks. Dark streaks of algae and water stains covered the walls and floors, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. I followed the footprints again, this time leading down the cliffside to the beach. The tide was high, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks. That's when I saw them. Dozens of figures stood at the water's edge, their pale, glistening bodies barely visible in the moonlight. They stood motionless, staring at me with those black, soulless eyes. One of them stepped forward, and I recognized it immediately. It was Alex. Alex? I whispered, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, his expression blank. His skin was pale and slick, his eyes hollow. But it was him. I could see it in the way he moved, the faint remnants of his humanity still clinging to him. "They've taken him," a voice said behind me. I spun around and saw an old man standing there, his face weathered by time and sorrow. He wore a tattered raincoat, and his eyes were filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "They took my son years ago," he continued, "and they'll take you too, unless you break the curse." "Curse?" I asked, glancing back at the creatures. "This town is theirs," he explained. "It always has been. The tide brings them back every year, and they take those who trespass on their land. But there's a way to end it." "How?" "You must give them what they want." The old man handed me a rusted blade, its surface etched with strange symbols. "They're bound to the sea, but they're bound to this place too. You have to sever the tie." He gestured toward the cliffs. "The altar is there. You'll know what to do when the time comes." With no other choice, I climbed the cliffs, the blade heavy in my hand. At the top, I found it, a stone altar covered in strange carvings, surrounded by ancient, crumbling statues. The creatures followed me, their movements silent but relentless. Alex was at the front, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. As the moon reached its peak, the symbols on the blade began to glow. The creatures circled me, their guttural clicks echoing in the night. With all my strength, I drove the blade into the center of the altar. The ground shook, and the air filled with an ear-splitting wail. The creatures writhed in agony, their forms flickering like shadows caught in the wind. One by one, they dissolved into the mist, their bodies pulled back into the ocean. Alex was the last to go. For a brief moment, his humanity returned, and he looked at me with clear, grateful eyes. "Thank you," he whispered before fading into the waves. The beach grew quiet, the tide retreating far into the distance. I left the town that night, vowing never to return. The nightmares lingered, but the tapping on my windows stopped, and the smell of salt water faded from my life. Mia was never found, and I knew deep down that she was gone. Years later, I heard rumors about the town. People said it had been swallowed by the sea, its cliffs crumbling into the waves. But sometimes on stormy nights, I hear the faint sound of waves crashing in the distance. And when I look out my window, I swear I see footprints in the sand, leading toward the water. The tide always comes back. The summer beach trip was supposed to be an escape, a chance for me and my 3 closest friends, Carla, Marcos, and Julia, to unwind after a grueling year. We chose a secluded beach, far from the crowded tourist spots, to enjoy some peace. The locals called it Praia do Silencio, Silent Beach. The name seemed fitting. The waves were calm, the sand untouched, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. But as soon as we arrived, I felt something was off. There were no birds, no fishermen, no signs of life except us. Just the relentless sound of the ocean, whispering secrets to the shore. Our rental house was a quaint little place perched on the edge of the beach. On the first evening, we explored the shoreline, collecting seashells and skipping stones. It was Julia who found it first, a strange, weathered carving half buried in the sand. "Look at this," she called out, holding up a small wooden figure. It was humanoid but distorted, with elongated arms and an oversized head. "It's creepy," Marcos said, taking a step back. "It's probably just some old carving from the fishermen," Carla said, shrugging. "Nothing to worry about." But as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was more than just a trinket. That night, the whispers started. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of murmuring voices outside my window. They were faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the waves, but they were unmistakable. I peeked outside, expecting to see Carla or Marcos playing a prank. Instead, I saw nothing but the dark expanse of the beach. The whispers grew louder, and I could swear they were speaking my name. I closed the window and pulled the curtains shut, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. The next morning, we found footprints in the sand. They weren't ours. The prints were enormous, far larger than any human foot, and they trailed from the water up to the back of our house before disappearing into the dunes. "Probably a wild animal," Carla said, though her voice lacked conviction. Marcos frowned. "An animal that big? On the beach? No way." Julia said nothing. She clutched the wooden figure tightly, her eyes darting nervously toward the ocean. The whispers returned, louder this time. Marcos and Carla heard them too. We gathered in the living room, too scared to sleep, our phones useless in the dead zone where no signals could reach. "Something's out there," Marcos said, gripping a flashlight like a weapon. As if in response, there was a loud thud against the back door. We froze, staring at the door as the handle began to turn. The door creaked open, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then wet footprints began to appear on the wooden floor, one by one, leading into the house. There was no one there. The air grew colder as the invisible presence moved through the house. Julia clutched the wooden figure, tears streaming down her face. "It's them," she whispered. "Who?" I demanded. "The drowned ones. The people who were lost to the sea." We didn't have time to ask her what she meant. The whispers turned into guttural growls, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. "Run!" Marcos shouted. We bolted out of the house and onto the beach. The moonlight illuminated the shoreline, and that's when we saw them. Figures emerging from the water, pale, bloated, and dripping with seawater. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths moved silently, as if chanting a song we couldn't hear. We sprinted toward the car, the creatures moving faster than seemed possible, their long, distorted limbs reaching out for us. Carla tripped and screamed as one of them grabbed her ankle, dragging her toward the waves. Marcos and I managed to pull her free, but she was shaking uncontrollably, her skin ice cold. When we reached the car, Julia hesitated, clutching the wooden figure. "They want this," she said, her voice trembling. "It belongs to them. Leave it," I shouted. She placed the figure on the sand and whispered something under her breath. The creatures froze, their glowing eyes fixed on the carving. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We piled into the car and sped away, the whispers fading behind us. We never spoke about that night again. Julia refused to explain how she knew about the creatures or the figure, and I didn't press her. But weeks later, I found a wet footprint outside my apartment door. On my bedside table was a small wooden carving, identical to the one Julia had left behind. And every night since, I've heard the whispers calling my name. The tide always comes back. The whispers didn't stop. They started softly, just a faint murmur in the back of my mind, growing louder each night until they drowned out my thoughts. I tried everything to block them out, music, white noise, even moving my bed to the furthest corner of the apartment, but nothing worked. The whispers always found me. The wooden carving on my bedside table began to change. At first, it was subtle, a dark spot here, a new crack there. Then the figure's eyes seemed to deepen, hollowing into pits that felt alive, as if they were watching me. I started dreaming of the beach. In every dream, I was standing at the water's edge, the tide pulling me closer. The figures from the ocean called to me, their arms outstretched. "Come back," they whispered. Desperate for answers, I called Julia. Her phone went straight to voicemail, so I drove to her apartment. Her door was unlocked. Inside, the place was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, the walls streaked with salt water and algae. The smell of the ocean was overpowering. On her kitchen table was a note, hastily scrawled in Julia's handwriting. "They won't stop. The carving binds them to us. I'm going back to end it." Panic surged through me. I called Marcos, but he didn't answer. Carla's phone was disconnected. I was alone. Against every ounce of instinct, I knew I had to return to Praia do Silencio. When I arrived, the town looked abandoned, the same eerie quiet hanging in the air. The beach house was still standing, though its windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. I followed the footprints to the water's edge, the wooden carving clutched in my trembling hands. The ocean was restless, waves crashing violently against the shore. "Julia!" I called, my voice barely audible over the roar of the sea. A figure emerged from the water. At first, I thought it was one of the creatures, but as it moved closer, I realized it was Julia, or what was left of her. Her skin was pale and glistening, her hair tangled with seaweed. Her eyes were hollow, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "They won't let you go," she said, her voice distorted, as though spoken through water. "Unless you give them what they want." "What do they want?" I demanded, holding up the carving. She shook her head. "It's not the carving. It's you." The tide surged forward, icy water lapping at my feet. Behind Julia, the other figures rose from the waves, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I understood then. The carving was just a marker, a beacon to draw us back. But the creatures didn't want the wood. They wanted souls, ours. "Take it back!" I shouted, throwing the carving into the water. The ocean erupted, waves crashing and pulling at me with unnatural force. The carving floated briefly before sinking beneath the surface, swallowed by the sea. The creatures paused, their heads tilting as if considering my offering. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then Julia stepped closer. "It's not enough." She reached out, her cold, wet hand gripping my wrist. The tide surged again, this time pulling me off my feet. I screamed as the water dragged me toward the ocean, Julia's grip unrelenting. The creatures closed in, their guttural whispers growing louder. "Let me go," I begged, thrashing against the current. "You can't escape," Julia said, her voice mournful. "But you can end it, for all of us." In a flash of clarity, I remembered the old man's words. "You must sever the tie." I reached into my pocket, pulling out the pocket knife I'd brought as a last resort. With a deep breath, I slashed at my wrist, severing Julia's grip. The water around me turned red, and the creatures recoiled, their whispers turning to screams. The tide surged one last time, pulling Julia and the creatures back into the depths. When I woke, I was lying on the beach, the sun rising over the horizon. My wrist was bandaged, though I didn't remember doing it, and the wooden carving was gone. The beach was quiet again. Too quiet. I left Praia do Silencio, and never looked back. But the ocean still calls to me in my dreams, and sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of whispers beneath the crashing waves. And when the tide is high, I feel a pull, like it's only a matter of time before they come for me again. The sea never forgets. The lighthouse keeper's warning. When my friend suggested spending the New Year's holiday at an isolated coastal village, I hesitated. The idea of ringing in the year by the sea sounded peaceful, but the stories surrounding the village were unsettling. The locals whispered about strange occurrences near the lighthouse that stood alone on a rocky outcrop, warning travelers to avoid it after dark. But Marcos, ever the thrill-seeker, laughed off the tales. "It's just a lighthouse," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" We rented a small beach cabin, just a short hike from the lighthouse. Our plan was simple: watch the fireworks at midnight, toast to the new year, and explore the lighthouse the next day. I wish we had never gone near it. The first night, I couldn't sleep. The rhythmic crash of waves was comforting, but something about the lighthouse light felt wrong. It didn't flash with the steady, predictable rhythm of other lighthouses I'd seen. Instead, it pulsed irregularly, as if signaling a message I couldn't understand. I stepped outside to get some air, and that's when I noticed it. A shadow, tall and thin, moved across the beam of light. It wasn't the lighthouse keeper. It was too large, its limbs too long, its movements unnatural. "Just tired," I whispered to myself, retreating inside. But the feeling of being watched lingered long after I shut the door. The next morning, Julia insisted we visit the lighthouse. Carla and Marcos agreed, though I protested, still shaken from the night before. We hiked up the rocky path, the wind howling around us. As we approached, the towering structure loomed overhead, its white paint peeling and its windows dark. An old man greeted us at the base. His face was weathered, his eyes sunken, and his voice raspy. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Marcos laughed. "What? Are we trespassing?" The keeper's expression didn't change. "The light is not for you. Leave before it calls you." "Calls us?" Julia asked, her brow furrowing. But the man didn't answer. He simply turned and disappeared into the lighthouse, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. That night, the lighthouse light flashed again, its erratic pulse more intense than before. Marcos, stubborn as ever, decided we should figure out what the light was signaling. "It's probably just some old machine malfunctioning," he said. We sat on the beach, watching the flashes. Carla jotted down the sequence in her notebook, trying to decipher a pattern. "It's repeating," she said after a while, her voice uneasy. "What does it mean?" Julia asked. Carla hesitated. "I think it's coordinates." We looked at each other, dread settling over us. "Coordinates to what?" I whispered. No one answered. That night, I woke to find Marcos gone. His bed was empty, the door to the cabin wide open. I woke the others, and we rushed outside, calling his name. The lighthouse light pulsed faster, its beams sweeping across the rocky shore. "Look!" Julia shouted, pointing toward the lighthouse. Marcos was standing at the base of the tower, staring up at the light. We ran to him, but as we got closer, the beam passed over him, and he was gone. No sound, no movement, just empty space where he had been standing. Panic set in, but we couldn't leave without Marcos. Ignoring the keeper's warning, we forced the lighthouse door open and stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the stone. We climbed the spiral staircase, each step echoing ominously. The light above pulsed brighter and faster, the symbols glowing faintly in its rhythm. When we reached the top, we found the source of the light, an enormous crystal suspended in midair, spinning slowly. Marcos stood before it, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Marcos!" Carla screamed, grabbing his arm. But he didn't respond. The light enveloped him, and he began to dissolve, his body breaking apart like grains of sand caught in the wind. "No!" Julia cried, but it was too late. Marcos was gone. The keeper's warning. The old man appeared behind us, his face grim. "I warned you," he said. "The light doesn't guide, it consumes." "What is it?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "A beacon for them," he replied. "It draws them here to feed." "Who?" Carla whispered. As if in answer, the light pulsed violently, and the walls of the lighthouse seemed to ripple. Shadows emerged from the beams, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. "They're coming," the keeper said. "You need to run." We bolted down the staircase, the shadows close behind us. The lighthouse groaned, its structure shaking as the light grew brighter. We barely made it out before the door slammed shut behind us. The light flickered once, then went dark. The beach was silent again, the sky clear, but Marcos was gone. We left the village the next morning, but none of us spoke during the drive home. The loss of Marcos hung heavy over us, and the memory of the shadows haunted every moment. That night, as I lay in bed, a flash of light illuminated my room. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. In the distance, far beyond the horizon, the lighthouse pulsed once more. And I knew it wouldn't stop calling me until I answered.